Well, Iris, it's 1 o'clock. Do you think we should get started?
If it's 1 o'clock, I guess we get started.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's get started then. Well, welcome everyone. It's so lovely to see all of you. My name is Amy Panton, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session today. And the first thing I want to do is introduce our author for today, Iris Gildea. So Iris is an associate professor of book and media studies at St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto. And she's also a community arts facilitator, an artist, a poet, and a survivor. So I'm gonna, to get us started off today, I'm just gonna read the blurb from Iris's book because she's gonna be talking about her book, The Poetry of Belonging, today. So, in The Poetry of Belonging, Healing with the Language of the Wound, Iris J. Gildea invites readers to envision radical ways forward regarding trauma theory and embodied healing. Using an autoethnographic approach, frameworks of feminist phenomenology, earth-based spirituality, and poetic inquiry, Iris' memories mix with imagination as ancient healing wisdom unleashes itself in her dreams and waking life. In part one, Iris critiques contemporary trauma theory from the inside out. She shows why traditional trauma theory's reliance on a praxis of deficiency that considers survivors of complex childhood trauma as broken is faulty. In part two, she pivots to provide a radically more integrative approach to healing using her own poetic inquiry practice, which she calls a beautiful process of discovery through the languaging of my wound and body. Iris invites readers on a journey of writing with the wound. She shows firsthand how self love and thriving emerge when poetry and earth based spirituality become a foundation of embodied belonging. Prompts, guidelines, and rituals are also offered for those who want to develop a practice of poetic inquiry to support their healing journey. So, Iris, hello.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for introducing the book. I haven't heard
Yes,
that blurb in a long time. I was like, wow, what else
what a
does
good blurb. Yeah, yes. Well, Iris, we prepared a few questions for today that we wanted to go through. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the book. So, Iris, your book is described as engaging with the language of the wound. So, can you expand on what that phrase means to you and how poetry in particular allows you to explore both wounding and healing?
Yes, thank you, Amy. You know, when I hear that now and I think of that now, I think it's for me in writing this book and using autoethnography, it was the idea that healing with complex childhood trauma requires embodiment and expression of our own experiences, which may or may not fit into any normative idea of what survivor is, what identity, what healing is. And so, for me, when I use that phrase, it is working with my feminist approach to trauma theory, which does look at trauma as translating from the Greek and meaning the word wound, and kind of ending there, that there is this wound and my wound speaks. And a lot of, I think, a lot of the way that I approach trauma theory in this book from a radical feminist perspective is to actually to separate, trauma as a wounding in my relationship with myself versus trauma as being allied with what I have survived, the ongoing systemic influences that marginalize and oppress. And when that separation happens, trauma brings me into my embodied experience with my own wounding. And especially with childhood trauma, you know, I think a lot of the results of both normative, societal, patriarchal approaches to healing are that we get taught to feel shame. I know I got taught to feel shame, for my own experience, for being a survivor, and that further wounds. And then it's like I'm further distanced from myself. And so, my path of healing is to listen to my wound and to allow it to speak. And for me, my wounding requires aesthetic intervention. It requires poetry. It requires sometimes visual art, and that there's no judgment of any of that language. It's just what it's expressing. And when I do that, I get to witness myself, and then I get to reclaim these parts of myself. I think especially when we have childhood trauma, yes, okay, there is what we survived. For me, that was extreme violence. But there's also all the parts of my little child self and her creativity and her love, and it's all compounded. And so allowing, the language of the wound is where I get to reclaim all of that. And it's not for anyone else. It's not for publishing. It's not for meeting standards of normal or an idea of healing in which I've overcome anything. I don't view healing as overcoming at all. And so for me, the language of the wound is this kind of journey of reclaiming my own embodied expressions, um, wherever they go.
Well, thank you so much for that, Iris. And I think as you're speaking, I was thinking about how I got to witness you speaking to that little Iris part of yourself while you were writing and tending to some of little Iris's wounds and helping her to heal too. So I really appreciate you sharing about that. I'm going to go a little bit off script as we sort of like move
Do
through
it,
our,
Amy. Do
and
it.
we love doing that. So Iris, I wanted to ask you a question. When I was going through my PhD, I had some mentors tell me that we should write from our scars and not from our wounds. So,
Mhm.
do you have any wisdom about that? How did you decide which was a scar and which was a wound?
Okay, so my like immediate response to that is that I had to rip a scar open and let it be fresh and open in order to find the language of my wound. I think there it's I think firstly, I think there's a binary implied there of scar and wounds that for me is not necessarily real. And I think that especially when we're talking about experiences that we've been journeying with for decades, which was my experience, um, we do get scars and they come from survival and they come from what we had to do to survive, in my case, in violence in the home, and then trying to go out into the world and then being taught really young that I'm not allowed to talk about what's happening. And then the way that colonial patriarchal white supremacy and ableism and all of these matrices of power teach us to move through the world. And so for me, those scars, there was still a pulsing wound underneath. And so by opening them, I got to come into a much more authentic embodied healing, because especially if part of our own journey has to literally been to have our body taken from us in different ways, embodiment is a messy journey. And add into that the complex intersection of disability, we're all going to have our own embodied journey. And so for me, I think if I were to like apply that and speak from the scar, I wouldn't have been telling my story. I would have been telling what I was told healing looks like. I would have been telling what a colonial patriarchal paradigm says healing is. And so for me, a lot about my book is about allowing the mess. And so I think a lot of scholarship, especially because again, it comes from kind of this false binary of rationality versus emotion that is rooted in the West, coming from the Enlightenment and patriarchy. I think there's a lot of fear around allowing stories and our messes and emotion. And for me, that's where all the juice is, and that's where so much meaning happens, and that's where healing happens. And then that's when that comes into praxis, and then theory can dance with that. And now we can change theory, and now we can change what we're doing by creating knowledge and wisdom. Um, I feel like I could keep talking about this, but that's that. I really love that question.
Awesome. Yeah, I was thinking too as you were talking that sometimes maybe that the whole thing about the scar is trying to encourage us to cover our wounds, to hide them. And so yeah, with this book, I had this image in my head when you were talking about opening your wounds, like you as you opened your journals, as you open
Mhm.
yourself. This book was such a beautiful opening of all these parts of yourself. So thank you for sharing with us, Iris. I think the next question that we have kind of goes beautifully into what we were just talking about. So, what was the most surprising or transformative part of writing the poetry of belonging? And did you discover something new about yourself in this process?
I discovered so many something news, so many new somethings about myself. I think I discovered new things at every stage of the writing process, of the publishing process, of the editing process, of the book launch process, of, even this morning, like this morning, I revisited the book because we're going to be chatting about it. And like, honestly, my first thought when I was reading this was like, wow, did I pour a lot of love into this book? Like, it's dripping with this love that love this book is also written, for folks who don't know, it's written in dialogue with the ocean, and that's kind of one of the rhythms that supports me being with my wound. And part of this book is about how nature, whether it's nature, relationship with nature, earth-based spirituality, and also art, when they accompany us, and I think I should have said this, that that's for me the process of opening the wound. Is I'm not alone doing that. I'm doing that with the ocean. I'm doing that with this incredible human being, Amy Panton, who has the most amazing press. And I highly encourage folks to send inquiries to Amy's press, um, because it's also not being done alone, and doing it with the ocean, doing it with poetry is creating a sense of belonging, which is what this book is about. And so, I mean, I think I discovered that. Like, I had this name, the poetry of belonging, was with me from the beginning, but I don't know that I fully understood or embodied what that was. And so I discovered this inherent belonging that I think, I can speak for myself and a lot of the women that I've sat in circle with. Um, when we survive in intense childhood trauma, that is taken from us, especially when it's in the family, and it's hard. And that sense of belonging. And yet, for me, embodiment also opens up connection and belonging to the ecosystems that we are a part of, to the aesthetic process that connects us to others. And so I think that was one of the biggest things I discovered, is that I actually do always have this inherent belonging. Um, and that's a game changer. Um, yeah.
Thank you, Iris. I went back and watched our presentation, our little YouTube video this morning, and I was thinking about you talked in the video about how you really sort of appreciate or uh, support the idea of nonlinear routes of healing. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what you think about nonlinear, and for folks who maybe have been crushed by the medical system, by therapy.
Yeah.
You talk about that in the book. Um, what does that look like for you, the nonlinear?
Yeah. And one response I'm having, and this is maybe coming from the panel that we were just on, but like, I'm also just looking at how embracing nonlinearity is embracing neurodivergence, is embracing, but for me, and the way that I use that in the book, I think there is, especially if we look at like commercial memoirs of the trauma genre, and it's like there's this arc. You can see the sarcasm coming into me as I use this as someone that critiques mainstream media for a living. But like, it's this arc. It's like, here was the horrible experiences, and here's where I just was down because of them. And now here I am. And this is kind of, whether it's a super crip narrative or it's that total overcoming all trauma. And it's like, and now I'm through it. And now I'm normal. And now I can perform in this way that normal people who don't live with what I embody or haven't lived through what I have can function. And for me, that's a violence to even teach that. It's a violence that is instilled into, I mean, that is instilled into Western psychology. It's in psychiatry, and it's in the language of many of the core texts that are used in psychotherapy programs. Like, it is this idea that healing is getting to a place where I can essentially function as someone who hasn't lived and or is living with what I embody. And it's just irrational. It's just irrational. And so for me, you know, nonlinearity refuses that entire model, that trajectory. And for me, nonlinearity comes from embodiment, you know, and it's like when we are, most of us, especially in the West, are taught to sever mind and body. We're taught to be in, you know, and then here we are, most of us move through academia, which loves to do this. And, you know, in the book, I work with the phrase body psyche, because I'm bringing in a little bit more than just that idea of mind. But I think when we allow the body consciousness to actually lead, and then that integrates with mind, we have a whole different reality. And, you know, I have learned so much from listening and journeying with my body, and it just changes everything. And then, you know, whether nonlinearity looks like today I feel great and tomorrow I feel like shit, and this is just it, and that's okay. That there's no expectation that I'm just going to have this continuing increase of the illusion and false myth of normal. But for me, it's also nonlinearity is also embracing my inherent creativity. It's like if I'm if I'm an artist and I approach my life as an artist, and I approach my scholarship as an artist, and I approach my identity as a queer woman as an artist, and everything as an artist, for me, there's this inherent creative energy, and that does not fit into a cognitively determined idea of what identity is. And my healing is a part of that. And so it's allowing the mess and finding beauty in the mess, which for me is a paradigm change. I know, I feel like I didn't totally even answer your question, Amy, but I'm just going.
No, that was beautiful. Thank you. I think I wanted to from here add one more question that wasn't in our plan. I hope that's okay.
Of course.
I was thinking this morning about how much you incorporate your dreams into this book,
Mm.
and how beautiful that was for me to read, and how much I feel like I got to know you on a deeper level by reading about your dreams. So can you talk to us a little bit about um, how did you record your dreams? How did you remember them? Which ones did you choose to put in the book, and why?
I love that question because we've never talked about it before. I love it. Um, it's funny because as you said that, I immediately remembered one of my central dreams, which is in the book, which actually came out of therapy. I'm just going to tell the story really quickly. So I've done a lot of therapy in my life, and I had a therapist that I worked with like every week for about 6 years. And she came in one day and she was like, I saw this film and I thought of you. And it was this documentary that folks here have probably seen, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, about going into a cave with 30,000-year-old cave paintings on them. And I watched it, and I had a dream of a woman in a cave painting. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and it was incredible. And I just like, I remember I was in my first ever solo apartment, which was huge for me, and turned out to be a flooding basement, but that was later. Mess, right? But I like jolted up awake, and I was just like, something just happened and I didn't know what. And and I did journal. So I wrote the dream down in my journal the next morning. Um, and then that did work its way into this book as kind of essential. And it was a central moment. And it was like something about that woman in the cave was me. And it was revealing the way that, now as I sit with this, I think that dream spoke to me about the way implicit memory works. And a big part of this book is kind of rejecting a lot of traditional trauma theories, binary of implicit and explicit memory, which leads into a deficiency praxis. And the way that my memory surfaced when it was time and as they surfaced in different ways. And, dream is liminality. Dream brings us into liminality. And for me, this is also nonlinearity. Um, but for me, to be a survivor of complex childhood trauma is to move through the world in a liminal realm. It is to have a relationship with my body and memory, and it's an ongoing relationship. And it's beautiful. And there was stages in my life when it was also scary and confusing. And so I think working with dreams has really helped me to understand liminality. And liminality is an inherent creative process. And so I work with dreams much the same way I work with a painting or a poem. And I disagree with a lot of formal dream therapy interpretations that kind of go into very translation, kind of cognitively derived A equals B. I like to work with them, which also comes from my expressive arts training, but as something that is just inherently creative and has metaphors for us to engage with. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much, Iris. I just have one more question for you.
Mhm.
Um, what advice would you give someone who's thinking about writing their own autoethnography, but is feeling a bit uncertain about sharing their story?
Mhm.
Um, and I also wonder if you could make a comment about how do you know when you're ready to share? Like you were
Mhm.
talking about like you
Mhm.
felt like these memories were coming to you, and I think when you and I first talked about this book, I felt like you were ready. Like you
Mhm.
were like already exploring this. How did you know you were ready?
Yeah. I think that's a huge question, and there's probably different stages to it. And also, like, before I wrote this book, I had been publishing articles about childhood trauma and autoethnography. They had a different voice to them, but I had still been publishing, But my first response is especially for folks with childhood sexual abuse, especially for folks with complex childhood trauma, is to just explore the language of the wound, is just to explore it and find our own way into our language, which is why we did include an appendix of prompts in the back of this book. And I think, Amy, why we need to do another workshop on poetic inquiry. Um, because for me, I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm also kind of working on a new autoethnographic piece on it because there is so much pressure to tell our story, I think, in like the commercial pop world, And when we look at how story gets shared there, like, firstly, a lot of these messages are coming from celebrities, and it's really about selling a story. And that's just part of this world that we live in. And so I think we can take in a lot of messages around what it means to share and tell story that may or may not be authentic. And now, if you're going to add into that folks working in the academic system, where there's going to be a lot of strict, different, and it depends who you get to work with and what your department's like, there's going to be a lot of parameters around what it means to tell story. So I think the most important thing is actually to let all of that go and for me, I'm a big advocate of journaling, whether that looks like someone writing or typing or text voice recording, but just coming into practices of expressing and flow without judging what emerges. And from there, I think sometimes we need to be with someone when we're in a stage of that. Maybe we're journaling in a group, or we're journaling with our therapist, or we're sharing it with it. For me, there's also, a stage of healing is witnessing our own language, witnessing our wound speaking through our own expressive practice. And I think as we do that and it becomes a practice, And so again, my story is unfolding. If I wrote this book now, it would be a different book. It's like, and that's part of nonlinear identity. And so our story is always going to keep shaping because our whole embodied psyche self is going to keep shaping. And that's why this book focuses on poetic inquiry as a practice. It is not about the finished story. It is not about the finished thing that I can publish and say it's done. It's just a practice, just like meditation is a practice. And I think the longer that we do that, we just gain knowledge and confidence and love of our own expressive voice, which is also the language of our wound, which is also a different facet of identity. And I think from there, it organically shifts into, I often say in my writing groups, where I say, I might not want to read this out loud, but this story really wants to be read out loud, or this piece really wants to be read out loud. And sometimes something really wants to be shared, and so then I think it's honoring when it wants to be shared and just asking ourselves, and maybe it just wants to be shared with a person, or maybe it does want to be published. Or maybe it wants to be, and so I think it's really important to start from the inside out, and it might be like, yes, I'm in a PhD and I want to use autoethnography and I want to tell my story. And there's most likely kind of a scholarly activism root behind there. And that's wonderful, but also not putting too much pressure on oneself to tell their story in a particular way, because what if that's not how our voice wants to speak? What if that's not how my story, which is also myself, which is also this embodied part of myself? What if the left part of myself wants to speak in a totally different medium than my right part? It's like, and allowing this creative process to be there. For me, that's a safer way of coming into sharing story than trying to fit my story into an established idea of what sharing story is. It's why I went and partnered with your press, Amy, because you are so committed to allowing folks to share story in certain ways. And I also think it's okay not to. I also think it's okay not to. I think it's okay for us to do it in our own time and to shift. Um, and also, if there's a fire in you that wants to share your story, then you get to share your story. It's just making sure that we share it in the way that feels empowering and authentic to ourselves. And that is confusing. I think when we're in academia, when we're in the current mediascapes of social media, where there's like, I'm not even going to talk about trauma on TikTok. I'm going to stop myself. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Iris, for sharing your wisdom with us. And I think we're going to move on now to you reading a section of the book. And then after that, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Okay. Um, okay, I'm gonna read just a bit from the beginning of the introduction to give folks a little taste of it. And then maybe I'll just read one of the poems or two of the poems. I have been in love with the Salish Sea since my late 20s. I grew up in New England and took trips to the Atlantic Ocean. It was the wilds of the Salish Sea, though, that broke straight through the protective numbing I'd worn over my psyche and heart since early childhood. There was something about the Salish Sea, the waters of the Pacific Ocean that curve up and flow into and around the northwest shores of the United States and Canada. When we met, my protective sheath crumbled almost instantly. Its waters spoke to me in a way I had not been spoken to before, taught me about myself and my journey with life. As I stood on the shore and watched the dance of those blue depths rising and washing back upon themselves with white-capped waves, there is nothing that describes what happened to me other than the rapture that comes when we fall in love. This relationship with the ocean has been the truest and most sustaining of my life. It would be a decade after that love at first sight meeting when I came to buy a small cabin in British Columbia, a 10-minute trip to the Salish Sea, and began to live between Toronto and the Salish Sea. We continue to have a steady rhythm of proximity and distance in our relationship, and I'm reminded of this now as I sit to write this introduction in the room I've rented on Malcolm Island. It is nighttime, and outside my window it is pitch black. I stood there a few minutes ago before sitting at my small writing table. I saw only a dark void. No stars in the sky, no lights in the distance. Only darkness met my gaze. A seemingly infinite void, a void accompanied by the most soothing of soundscapes, the waves of the Salish Sea washing gently up onto the shore and back out to sea. As I looked out at that void, I could not see her there, the ocean that returned me to myself, but I could hear her. There is something in this moment of staring out at infinite darkness, having no ability to see what is there, but knowing it is there, and knowing its presence and life force is vital to my own. This experience captures for me what it is to be a survivor of complex childhood trauma. I believe that we survivors are experts at seeing in the dark. We learn to understand the contours and textures of living in that realm. Those textures and contours speak of a language that our society does not talk about, that many do not even know exists. As a result, we are systematically taught to forget that we understand this rich and implicit language. My love with the Salish Sea helped me to remember. It reminded me that I already knew how to speak this language, not with my mind, but with my body and my own spirit of survival. Throughout this book, I refer to this language as the language of the wound. It is also an embodied poetry of phenomenological belonging. While I appreciate all the work of trauma theorists and therapists, all the pairings of neuroscience with various types of recovery theories, even somatic, part of the reason I am writing this book is because as a survivor of extensive violence and complex childhood trauma, none of these professional and clinical realms served me very much. I tried so many of them. To this day, I have yet to meet someone educated by traditional trauma theory and in a position of clinical standing and power, be it therapist, psychologist, or therapy educator, who is fully capable of setting aside all of the conditioning of that theory and able to sit with me a moment in the void of liminal darkness that some of us grow up befriending from before we are able to speak full sentences. I have met many survivors that will sit here with me, many poets and artists and grassroots activists who are also survivors. But all the folks doing the well-intentioned work of our most dominant trauma paradigms and mainstream healing institutions, for me, failed repeatedly as they tried to insert me into their paradigms of wellness, recovery, and identity, rather than just sitting with me for a moment and listening to the void. When we remember how to listen to this liminal realm, glimmering gold streaks through a dissonant sounds of earth, survival, and becoming. A dance of flesh and spirit hum a tantalizing melody, and nonlinear truths surface on the goosebumps of knowing that rushes across time and flesh. So there's a little snippet from the intro. And then, so this book it is theory, it is poetry, it is narrative, it is the ocean, it moves in and out. And I think one of my favorite sections is the chapter where we just have autoethnographic poetics, and they're just allowed to stand on their own. And they're just by the dates that they came from my journals. And then I engage with them after in a reflection that's really feels organic to me. So I'm just going to read a few of those poems that came from my journals. So this is Revelations. Her hands grip through the fog. Her voice ruptures through the membranes of my dream. Remember, she says, remember. Her voice a drumbeat on my tongue, my temples throb and sync with her rhythms as her juices run down my cheeks, throat, and breasts. I wake, sweating in the night. There is no difference between the sound of these waves, their constant rolling onto shore, and me. No separation, no division, the wind too, so gentle on my face. I am the wind, the waves, the raking of the shoreline. I am all of it and none of it. And this one is on the Cortez Ferry with St. Teresa of Avila. Her lips part mine and I speak with her tongue on mine, feel with her hands in mine, our bodies one, our voices aligned. Perfect timbre of heart and mind. My soul releases its grip on the past, wrinkles of skin, scales of past memories, all become an effervescent tone of golden memories speaking on the sea. How's that?
Beautiful. I could listen to you for hours. Okay. So, Iris, are you okay if we move now to some questions
Of
from
course.
folks? Okay. I noticed there's one in the chat from Mao. And so they said that they're a master's student from Keio University in Japan, and they felt their interests are similar to yours. And so they have two questions. So the first one is they're currently working on autoethnography relating trauma, therapeutic, and using poetry. But they said they've hit a dead end because they feel there are hurdles in their surroundings. So, what kind of environment were you in that allowed you to write what you have written now?
Thank you, Mal, for this question. And so, I mean, I'm thinking about when I first started writing at autoethnographic poetics and trauma. Um, I was already working as a professor. So I actually wrote a very traditional PhD thesis in phenomenological hermeneutics and philosophy through comparative literature. And I didn't even know autoethnography existed at that time when I was in grad school. So when I came to autoethnography, I did have really the privileged position of already having found a position. That said, I did not have any community around it. Firstly, I was the only female faculty member at a Catholic institution for a very long time. And I think I just stumbled upon autoethnography and I just started doing it. And so I just started submitting, and I had already had a daily poetry journaling practice for years at this point. And so I just kind of started intuitively merging theory and poetry because I really saw nothing that was supporting me and my, like, I would go and look at the trauma theory books in the bookstore and like I would get them and it would just not support me. And then I found a couple poetry books that were written by survivors. And I found some books written by survivors, but they were absolutely not from an academic background. And they were the only things that spoke to me. So I just said, well, I'm just gonna do this. And so, I hadn't even really found any autoethnographic poetics that were working with theory and the trauma and the way I was. So I did it in a lot of isolation. Um, but I didn't need anyone to sign off on it because I already had a position in academia. Um, I hope that responds to the question.
Thank you, Iris. And then the second part of Mao's question is, they said, I feel like they're interested in trauma studies, but they're scared to delve deeply into it. And that's because it seems like something they wouldn't have had to think about if they hadn't had a traumatic experience. So to be honest, they feel uneasy about doing it for the rest of their lives with using it for a long time. So have you thought about this and worked on this field of study up to now?
Yes, you know what, Mao, this actually gets to one of Amy's questions about surprises. I finished this book and I was like, I think I'm done with trauma theory. I think I'm done, which isn't entirely true because I am working on a piece, but it's different. So I do think it's really important to honor our own ebbs and flows with how much we want to engage, whether it's trauma theory or, the way that we're writing into disability studies or what narrative or personal narrative. It's really important, I think, to honor where we're at. And again, this comes back to our voice and what we want to share. I also think when we're talking specifically about trauma studies, I think there's a lot of reason to be cautious of going into it because the majority of what is out there is not survivor centered. The majority of what is out there is written by people in positions of power who may or may not be survivors as well. It's not disclosed because it's coming from a tradition that sees a very necessary binary between kind of professional and survivor. And so I do think, I mean, we're at a conference of autoethnography, I do think looking into the places that feel supportive to you around trauma, if that's autoethnography and trauma, if that's something like MAD studies, if that's the intersections of disability and trauma, but written by disabled folks, however it is coming. But I think it's important to find the communities of scholarship that feel supportive, because I mean, there's a lot of trauma theory that I get either quite angry at, or I just need to stop reading for a bit because it is harmful. It's not survivor centered. Um, so again, I think it's and this is where I think embodiment is so important, because if we are feeling, drawn and we're wanting, and it's feeling like it's opening up places of thriving, even if that comes with a bit of fear or uncomfort, like as long as it's okay enough. But if we're forcing ourselves to write academically about something that's forcing us to make a split between mind and body, that could be wounding. And so, working in a way that we take care. I mean, Amy will probably remember, like, there was a point when we were working on this book, like, and I was like, I don't want to publish the first half. I just want to publish the second half, which is all my creative poetry and my narrative and my dreams and all of this. Whereas the first half is like taking on traditional trauma theory as a cultural theorist and feminist phenomenologist, and like arguing why it's kind of irrational, because it was more academic-y. It was more of those kind of traditional theory. And the survivor in me really loves to speak through poetry. Um, but I have a very strong theorist in me as too, and she gets to speak as well. So, I think it's a personal journey, but I think there's also wisdom. I think there is wisdom, because we are talking about traditions of meaning making that absolutely come from power over paradigms.
Thank you, Iris. Jen, I think you have a question.
Hi, yeah. So, hi, Iris. Lovely to see you again. One of the things that really stood out for me was your description of getting in touch with your creative child. And I don't have any formal knowledge of trauma theory, but I've got formative trauma myself, and I've been through a lot of therapy. And one of the things that I found is that the particularly in psychoanalytic frameworks, there's a lot of stuff about needy, abandoned children, which I find quite gendered as well, because they link then into personality disorder frameworks and stuff. And I have rejected these narratives when they've been applied to me in therapy, but I've found a way of coming to terms or thinking through them about, actually I need to recapture all of my childhood, the creative bits as well. And I just wondered had had a similar recapturing of the whole of that sense of self of child, and the qualities of childhood that are the ones that are the archetype of creative childhood, as well as the reality, which was probably very difficult. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it
Oh, it
does.
makes total sense. It makes total sense, Jen. It's also like opens up so much. And I think one of like the first thing that comes to mind, just because you mentioned attachment theory and these kind of, these traditional ways, is partly influenced by kind of eco-psychology and by my own radical, like I have a strong rejection of attachment theory as the basis of Western psychoanalysis and psychiatry and psychotherapy. Because it does come from a deficiency praxis. And also, like, as I was talking about with that idea of belonging, like there are attachments that are primary, for some of us, and that can be the ecosystem, you know, that we're part of. And so I have a strong rejection of attachment theory in a lot of its kind of formal ways. In terms of that childhood creativity, I also, you know, like I went through so much traditional therapy, and it was like part of it was tradition. I also worked with like someone who was really progressive and a Gestalt and Buddhist therapist, and like wouldn't have identified themselves as a traditional therapist, but now years out of it and later I can see how traditional it was still. And again, because there was an arc of, you know, this is what integration looks like or feels like. And so the reason I say that is because that therapist actually took me through so much inner child work. And it wasn't until I had really said, okay, I'm done. Like there's a different way and it's mine and this is not working, that I saw how a lot of that inner child work actually wasn't the most helpful for me. And what has been helpful is actually, you know, I think we all are going to have our own language, and is to not separate the wounded child from the incredibly creative child, from the loving child, from the curious child, from the sad child. Like it's all there. And like the more and more that I reflect on my life, like I'm aware that part of the reason that I survived what I survived is because of how much I loved. Like I just freaking loved. And rather than have that pathologized, which is what most folks have tried to do, you know, it's like, and so how do I get back to that part of me? And she loves to talk to animals, and she loves to play and make a mess with paint, and she loves, you know, and it's like allowing that. And maybe when I'm in there, she's fucking angry, and then she's going to write a poem about that too. And that's great. And that's beautiful, you know, but it's like, just allowing it. And I tend to think of my inner child as actually my wisdom. Like she lived through a lot of shit and she survived. And it's like, how is that like, and that's where I wish that clinical trauma began with acknowledging the courageous spirit of creativity through which we survive. End story. You know, it's like, that's it. And maybe there's ways that I want to relate that I'm not totally relating, and I'm going to work, and there's growth, and there's parts of myself I'm going to, you know, but that's not deficiency. That's empowerment. Um, and so I think it's also like coming into creativity and really unlearning what so many of us who go through formal academic and education are taught. Like it's supposed to look a certain way. It's supposed to be this, it's good or bad. And just making the paint or writing the poem or letting it be. And just, again, because it's a practice. And really trying to suspend any judgment. And then I think for there, that can also sink into those childhood experiences where there was most likely judgment, you know, and we were also taught to judge ourselves. And then that's also reclaiming. I don't feel like I went on a big response to what you said, Jen, but it's just a big question. Yeah.
Thank you, Iris. That actually meant a lot personally.
Thank you, Jen, for asking.
Okay, so I'm aware of time. We have about just a couple of minutes left. So, Katerina, I think you have a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you. So, my question relates to so as a person displaced because of the war, I write my autoethnography in the form of letters to land, and I view people and land both as victims of epistemic violence. And I'm wondering, you said that you address the ocean, so whether you address the issue of more than human justice and erasure in your work, and if yes, then how that relates to your personal individual pain and experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina, especially for sharing like a glimpse of your project with us. It sounds really incredible. This is something that I do a lot in my teaching. I have a lot of classes that are about environmental justice and trauma and the intersections of them in my book. In my book, it deals with themes of colonization and decolonization, and then the way that that's part of the system of power that's always working with land and people and bodies. But I don't think that the book addresses it exactly in the way that you're asking. But of course, I mean, it's a necessary lens. It's the lens for, you know, a lot of people. And the way, I think you're also just getting at the way that, like from a cultural trauma theory framework, our personal trauma is always part of these systems of power that we are embedded within, which is also always going to involve imperialism and colonization and power over ideologies and what that's doing to land and peoples and displacement. So I don't really have a response other than to say absolutely, it's all part of it.
Thank you.
But I do love what, I know we're out of time, Amy, and I'm going to do in 20 seconds. I'm just going to say, but I do love, like, I think you're bringing it into addressing the land and talking, you know, I think that when we merge it with our liminal reality, that's both embodied healing. And I believe that's also part of the work of environmental justice and forming community as well.
Thank you so much, Iris, for sharing with us. We so appreciate your wisdom and your creativity and your way of being in the world, your gentle and fierce way of being in the world. And thank you, everyone, so much for coming to the panel today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amy. And it was so lovely to chat, and I'm very grateful. And if you're curious about the book, we should, however, drop Matt and Cripps. Maybe, Amy, will you drop Matt and Cripps' website in there? And then folks can, we have it in paperback and also there's digital formats.